Welcome to 15-Minute Fridays, a weekly Bible teaching that is quick, powerful, and for you.
Hey everybody, welcome to week 3 of Do You See What I See on 15-Minute Fridays. I'm so glad you're joining me today. Gonna jump right into the word because boy, there is some good stuff that we are gonna get a hold of today. I'm so glad that you tuned in. We have been studying and seeing the appearances of the angel Gabriel around the nativity story. We've seen him appear to Mary. We've seen him appear to Zacharias, the father of John the Baptist. And today we're actually gonna look at the third appearance, and that is to Joseph. Now this one is going to be a little bit different though, y'all, because, well, I'm not going to tell you why yet. You got to wait and see. But it's very different from the way that Gabriel encountered Mary and the way that Gabriel encountered Zacharias. One thing that we are going to do that's similar, though, that is going to stay the same, is we're going to work this in reverse chronology, okay? So I want to read a verse. This is kind of the end, and then we're going to back up, okay? Matthew 1:24-25 says, He, Joseph, took Mary as his wife, but he did not have her as a husband would have a wife until she gave birth to a son, and then Joseph gave him the son the name Jesus. Now, I'm sure we've all read the Christmas story, heard the Christmas story, watched the Christmas story being portrayed, and there's all of these moving pieces of the puzzle. But you know what I've noticed? We often skim over some really important pieces of the Christmas story, and this is one of them. What about this piece? What about Joseph's role? This verse is pretty simplistic, that Joseph gave him the name Jesus. It's pretty clear. Joseph married Mary. Mary had the baby. Joseph gave him his name. But we're going to, again, work it in reverse chronology. It's a big deal that Joseph did that he named Jesus. So I'm going to go back hundreds of years to Zechariah, the book of Zechariah in the Old Testament. He was a prophet, and here is a prophecy that he gave. Zechariah 6:13. It is he, speaking of Jesus, who will build the temple of the Lord. He will be clothed with majesty and will sit and rule on his throne. And he will be a priest on his throne. And there will be harmony between the two. Now, if you've hung out with me any amount of time, you know that I love to quote my dad, who coined this phrase, God doesn't do random. And that phrase fits perfectly with this truth, with this biblical prophecy. We talked about Mary last week being favored by God. She gave God her yes. She accepted his divine invitation to be part of humanity's redemption story. She was humble. She was obedient. But what about Joseph? So we look and we know about Mary, but why did God choose Joseph? Well, I'm glad you asked. Part of why God chose Joseph is wrapped up in Zechariah's prophecy. He will be a priest who will sit on his throne. Now, you have to understand something. I got to give you a little bit of biblical history and tradition here, okay? In Jesus's time, there was a role of a priest and there was a role of a king. Very separate roles. The priest did not do the role of a king. The king did not do the role of a priest. They were very separate. They were not allowed to cross over. In other words, it was a, hey bro, stay in your lane kind of thing, okay? Kings and priests. So when this prophecy came out from Zechariah, he will be a priest who will sit on a throne, it was probably a little troubling or confusing to some people. So what if Jesus would have to be a priest and a king? How is that going to happen? Well, here's the deal. Remember, we talked about Mary last week. Let me tell you about Mary. Mary was a cousin to Elizabeth. And when we read, the mother of John the Baptist, when we read about Zacharias and Elizabeth, we find out, the Bible mentions, not random, that Elizabeth was from the line. Here's what Luke 1:5. Let me just read it to you. There was a priest named Zacharias who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Well, Aaron was the first priest in the Bible. Elizabeth and Mary were cousins. Mary also came from the line of Aaron. So Mary's descendants would be from a line of priests. Okay, there's one check, right? He's going to be a priest, check, who sits on a throne. How's that happen? Well, it's not random that God chose Joseph, because if you read Matthew chapter 1, you're going to read the genealogy of Jesus, Jesus's family tree. Lots of names that are hard to pronounce, lots of letters, lots of words. But when you start reading, you're going to come down and find the mention of a man named David, King David, the most famous king in biblical history, a man after God's own heart. But when you keep reading and you jump down to about verse 15 or so, we see something very interesting. The Bible mentions a man named Eliezer who had a son named Matthan. And Matthan had a son and he named him Jacob. And Jacob had a son and he named him Joseph. And Joseph was the earthly father of Jesus. Joseph came from the line of David. Joseph was from the line of kings. Mary, the line of priests. So when the prophet Zechariah said he will be a priest who sits on a throne, it came through Mary as a priest and Joseph as a king. Is that just not the coolest thing ever? God doesn't do random. That's one of the reasons that God chose Joseph, but that's not the only reason. Let's talk about Joseph's character, because listen to this. When God chooses someone, it's never on accident. It's never on accident. We see part of why God chose Joseph, but what else? What about Joseph's character? There had to be more. Well, let's fast forward now from the prophet Zechariah all the way forward a few hundred years. Let's go to the prophet Isaiah. This is going to be Isaiah speaking to Joseph's family, the house of David. They were asking him for a sign, and this was what Isaiah said to him. He said, "Therefore, the Lord himself," in 7:14, "will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel." Okay, I want you to hold on to that verse because we're going to come back here because there's something very significant and important about that verse. David's family, King David's family, was promised that somehow they were going to be a part of the messianic story. They were going to also be a part of God's plan to redeem humanity. And now we know that that would happen not through David, not through Solomon. Hundreds of years later, it would happen through a man named Joseph. We don't know a whole lot about Joseph. The Bible doesn't tell us a lot about it. We know he was a carpenter. We know that Matthew calls him faithful. The one thing that we do know is that he was betrothed to Mary, which was a huge deal in biblical times because betrothal was just as significant actually as marriage. There was an engagement, but then there was the betrothal. The betrothal was so huge that if they were going to break off this relationship, it would have to be by actual divorce. The betrothal was a legally binding agreement between a man and a woman. The couple would, when they're betrothed, from then on be seen as husband and wife. This was a big relationship that Joseph was in, a very serious one with Mary. So when we read Matthew 1 about Joseph, when he heard about Mary being pregnant, can you imagine? Listen to what Matthew says about Joseph. Because Joseph, her husband, betrothed but husband, was faithful to the law and yet did not want to expose Mary to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. According to the customs and the law, this would be a public scene, a public case, but Joseph didn't want to do that to Mary. He was choosing to do this quietly, which leads me, I don't know about you, but it kind of leads me to think that Joseph really must have loved Mary to want to protect her in that way. You know, the Apostle Paul in the New Testament talks to us about the roles of a husband and wife and about the wiring of a man and a woman. And Paul tells us that men are wired to the place where they prefer respect. So Paul speaks to men and says, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and laid down his life for her." And then he speaks to the women and the wives and he says, "Wives, honor your husbands." Men prefer respect, honor, and respect. Women, wives, prefer love. So If a man's ultimate wiring and what really is important to him is to be respected and honored, I want you to take a minute and put yourself in Joseph's shoes, especially if you're a guy. Y'all, I think so many times we idolize biblical characters when really we need to humanize them. This was a real man. He felt betrayed. He felt humiliated. He was embarrassed. He was extremely hurt. He was a real man feeling real things. Until the angel Gabriel came. Listen to what Gabriel says to Joseph. An angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Now that's different. Remember, Mary was awake. Zacharias was awake. They had visions. Joseph was asleep. Sidebar. I think he was probably so going crazy in his mind and couldn't stop thinking about this that the only time God could speak to him maybe was in the quietness of his sleep. He said to him, Joseph, son of David, don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She's going to give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. All of this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said to the prophet. Listen, this is a huge deal. Gabriel calls him the son of David. When Joseph hears that, he's like, yeah, you know my family. This is a really big deal. I know what's been prophesied. And then he tells him that Mary's telling you the truth. I mean, then can you imagine how Joseph must have felt? Oh my gosh, this relief. She wasn't lying. She was telling me the truth. Matthew 1:24 says, when Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord told him to do, and he took Mary as his wife. I have in my head that he woke up and ran to Mary's house and banged on the door, and then she came, Joseph, what's going on? And he could say, you were telling the truth. You were telling the truth. I don't know. I have a flair for the dramatic, so don't mind me. But I imagine that maybe that's what happened with Joseph, because he was so excited to find out that he had been chosen. He was from the house of David, the one prophesied about. He would be the father of the Messiah. So let's go back to that verse I told you to hang on to, because I want to end here. When Isaiah gave the prophecy, the Lord will give you a sign, the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. Here's the weird and interesting thing about that. There was a key word that was left out in translation between the word and will. Give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel. The word left out is he. The virgin will conceive, give birth to a son, and he will give him the name Emmanuel. Matthew 1:25 says Joseph gave him the name Jesus, Emmanuel. Joseph was the he. Joseph had this understanding of what it really meant to be obedient to what God was saying and to just embody what God was doing in a moment. You know, we had a phrase that we used with our kids for a long time. It was incomplete obedience is disobedience. Joseph could have done a whole lot of things here, picked and chose, but Joseph chose to fully obey. Was it easy? Heck no. Was it worth it? You better believe it. Which leads me to this question for you today. What if God has in mind for you to be the generation changer in your family? What if you're the one? I told you last week this phrase, you were just, from Pastor Mark Batterson, you are just one defining decision away from a totally different life. What if we said this? You are just one defining decision away from a totally different attitude, a totally different family, a totally different future, a totally different Christmas, a totally different life. Listen, remember, when God chooses people, he doesn't do it on accident. God chose Mary, he chose Joseph, and God has chosen you. He doesn't do random.